cold steel of the evidence table, a single fMRI scan printed on translucent film glowing under a desk lamp. The date stamp is 2008. The first year, U.S. court admitted a brain scan to argue that a defendant's violence wasn't a choice, but a wiring failure. That scan sat in a file for 3 years before anyone looked at it again. By then, 2 more bodies had been found. That's not an outlier. That's a pattern. Of the 34 serial killers active in the United States between 2018 and 2022, 11 had documented head injuries, abnormal scans, or known neurological deficits that were never flagged by the justice system. Not because the data didn't exist, but because nobody was trained to read it. You've been told the system works, that if someone kills 3 times, someone else will catch them. The question is, what if the evidence to stop them was already sitting on a shelf? Here's what the fMRI reveals. The human brain has a specific circuit that regulates the impulse to use lethal force against another human. It's not in the amygdala. It's not in the prefrontal cortex alone. It's the connection between them, a tract of white matter called the uncinate fasciculus. When that tract is damaged, the break between emotional arousal and violent action fails. You can see it on a scan. You can measure it. And in 2008, a lab in New Mexico published data showing that this failure predicted future violent behavior with 71% accuracy. That's higher than any psychological assessment used in court today. But the scan doesn't stop there. What it shows about the anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that detects conflict between impulse and consequence, is where the real story lives. In every serial killer whose brain has been scanned post-conviction, there's a measurable reduction in gray matter density in that region. Not subtle, not ambiguous. On average, 11% less tissue. That's not a character flaw, that's a detectable lesion. Now let me tell you what that means in practice. In 2010, a 27-year-old man in Texas was arrested for a knife attack on a stranger. He had no prior record, no history of violence. The prosecutor asked for life. The public defender requested a brain scan. The judge denied it. The man was convicted and sentenced to 45 years. 4 years later, an FBI cold case unit connected him to 2 unsolved murders that occurred before his arrest. Both victims had been attacked in the same way. The scans that would have shown his pattern, the same reduced VMPFC volume, the same damaged uncinate fasciculus, were never taken. The total cost of ignoring that single scan, 3 lives. That's the kind of number that sounds abstract until you put a face on it. If you've ever read a crime headline and felt the justice system just doesn't make sense, you know that uneasy feeling of randomness, of wanting to see the data behind the verdict. This is where that data lives. If you just recognize that the Texas case was not an isolated error, but a predictable consequence of a system that refuses to read the evidence, write it in the comments. 2008. That single year is the hinge, the moment the tool existed and the system chose to look away. And if you want to stay with the data trail, as we trace every case that proves the pattern, subscribe. You're not going to find this breakdown anywhere else. The Dunedin longitudinal study tracked 1,037 children from age 3 to 35. From the first, they were scanning their brains, tracking their impulse cycles, mapping their reward ratios. By age 26, 88% of the participants who would go on to commit violent offenses showed a measurable deviation in their orbitofrontal cortex, the region that weighs immediate reward against long-term cost. Their threshold was lower. They didn't choose violence because they were evil. They chose it because the break was weaker. And here's the gut punch. Those scans were available years before the first offense. Nobody checked. Which raises a question the archives don't want you to find. What if the justice system already has the tool to prevent 3 serial killers every year, but refuses to use it because the implications are too uncomfortable? Let's talk about those implications. The FBI's behavioral science unit has known about the link between frontal lobe damage and serial violence since the 1980s. By 2005, the first fMRI evidence was admissible in a UK court RVH, where a defendant's scan showed a clear abnormality in his ventromedial prefrontal cortex. He was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The UK court recognized that the scan mattered. The US has no such standard. Think about that for a second. The United States accounts for roughly 30 of the estimated 50 to 60 active serial killers worldwide at any given moment. That's 60% of humanity's serial killers concentrated in one country. And we have a tool that can predict violent recidivism with 71% accuracy, higher than any clinical interview, higher than any risk assessment questionnaire. And we choose not to deploy it, not because it doesn't work, not because it's too expensive, but because admitting that violence has a detectable biological signature would force us to rewrite everything we think about free will, punishment, and justice. The threshold was never about the science. It was about what we're willing to accept. If this made sense instantly, it's because you already knew. Some people hear this and ignore it. You're not that person. You already recognized that the number doesn't add up, that the system isn't broken in the way you were told. It's broken in a much deeper way. Let me show you exactly how. There's a specific mechanism at work here. It's not about a single scan showing a single defect. It's about a cumulative pattern that appears across multiple datasets. The Mind Research Network in New Mexico scanned 86 violent offenders over a decade. Using a machine learning algorithm trained on structural MRI data, they predicted which prisoners would commit a violent act after release with an AUC of 0.78, meaning they were right more than 3/4 of the time. The algorithm didn't need a full psychological profile. It didn't need a childhood history. It just needed a brain. Write this in the comments. What part of this did you already know but never said out loud? Here's what the scan reveals that most people miss. The brain doesn't have a violence center in Hiasham. It has a regulatory network. The impulse to use lethal force is present in every human. It's part of our evolutionary inheritance. What separates a law-abiding citizen from a serial killer isn't the presence of that impulse. It's the strength of the brake. The uncinate fasciculus is that brake. When it's damaged, the amygdala's fear signal fires without constraint. The prefrontal cortex can't apply the brake in time. The result is a flashpoint that doesn't stop. And the courts are making decisions based on motive, means, and opportunity, while the real cause is sitting in the white matter. The cost of ignoring this pattern is not theoretical. The Homicide Research Working Group estimated that there are approximately 30 active serial killers in the United States at any given time. If even 10% of those could have been identified and prevented by a brain scan, 3 killers per year, that's 120 lives over a decade. The economic cost per homicide to U.S. society is $2.9 million. 3 killers per year, each responsible for an average of 1.5 victims in the time between when the scan would have been taken and when they're caught. That's 4.5 victims annually. At $2.9 million per victim, we're looking at over $13 million per year in avoidable losses. And that's just the financial cost. The human cost is incalculable, which raises a question that most people avoid because the answer is too destabilizing. Those 3 killers per year, they're not the total. They're the minimum. They're the ones who leave the body count in newspaper headlines. But what about the ones who don't? What about the perpetrator who attacks once, the one who injures but doesn't kill, the one who slips through because the threshold was lower but not low enough to cross into homicide? The same scan would have caught them too. The Japanese justice system tested this. In 2015, a research group at Kyoto University scanned 1,200 male participants and tracked them for 5 years. They found that reduced gray matter volume in the orbitofrontal cortex predicted not just violent behavior, but the escalation of violent behavior. The participants with the lowest volumes didn't just have more incidents, they had more severe incidents. The scan wasn't predicting a single event, it was predicting a trajectory. Left ignored that trajectory, bent toward a body count. The data is not ambiguous. The pattern is not hidden. The scans exist. The research has been replicated across labs, across countries, across decades. The only thing missing is a system willing to look at them. What does that mean for you? It means the next time you see a headline about an arrest following a string of murders, you already know what the backstory might have looked like. You know there was a chance, a measurable, documented, 71% accurate chance that a scan could have flagged the risk years earlier. And you know that chance was not taken, not because of malice, because of a decision repeated thousands of times to treat violence as a moral failing rather than a neurological event. The justice system is not broken in the way you were told. It's not underfunded. It's not lacking laws. It's lacking the willingness to see what the evidence reveals. And that failure costs 3 serial killers per year, minimum. That cost is not a theory. It is not a political argument. It is a documented, measurable, avoidable pattern of harm. You now know more about what actually drives a killer's brain than 90% of the people who sit on juries. You know that the uncinate fasciculus is the brake. You know that the orbitofrontal cortex is the throttle. You know that when the connection is damaged, the impulse cycle doesn't stop. And you know that the data to catch these perpetrators before they kill has existed since 2008. The question was never what to look for. The question was whether we had the courage to look. This scan doesn't just explain one killer, it predicts the next one, and the one after that. We've known for a decade what to look for, but we keep pretending it's a moral choice, not a neurological lesion. If you want to understand the evidence before society catches up, subscribe. We don't look away, but neither do we pretend that looking is enough. Because knowing the wiring doesn't change the verdict, it changes what the verdict means. It shifts the question from how could he do that to what made the brake fail. And that shift is not comfortable. It forces you to sit with a truth that the justice system has spent decades avoiding, that some people are born with a shorter leash, and the system punishes them for pulling at the end of it. If you made it this far, you already know the cost of looking away. Drop it in the comments, 3 per year. That number is the ledger. It's the minimum tally of what we accept by refusing to scan. Subscribe to keep counting the cases they don't want you to see. The brain scan in that 2008 file wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype. It showed exactly what we needed to see, years before the bodies accumulated. The reason it sat untouched wasn't technical failure. It was institutional refusal. The cost of that refusal is not just 3 serial killers per year. It's the quiet erosion of any pretense that the system is designed to prevent harm rather than simply punish it after the fact. There is no comfortable ending here. There is no reform proposal that fixes this overnight. There is only the documentation, the data, and the decision you make about what to do with it. The scan exists. The pattern is known. The only question left is whether 3 more names will be added to a file that should never have been opened in the first place.